There is a document sitting in a private archive that has never been officially acknowledged, never been assigned an author, and never been explained. And every single person who has read it in full has said the same thing. Something inside them broke open, quietly, like a door they did not know existed, suddenly swinging wide in the dark. Not in a frightening way, in the way that makes you realize you have been living in one room of a house with 100 rooms, and you just found the hallway. I have spent a long time trying to decide whether to talk about this, because once you hear what this document contains, and once you understand where it came from, you cannot unhear it. And I am not sure that is always comfortable. But I think it is necessary. So let me start with the moment that pulled me into this entirely. A colleague sent me a single scanned page from this manuscript. No context, no explanation, just the page and a message that said, "Read this and tell me a human being wrote it." I read it at my kitchen table at something like 2 in the morning with a cold cup of coffee in front of me and the kind of tired that makes everything feel slightly unreal. And I remember the exact sensation. It was not excitement. It was not fear. It was the feeling you get when you are walking a path you have walked 100 times and you suddenly notice a door in a wall that you are absolutely certain was not there before. Not threatening, just impossible. I sat there for probably 20 minutes without moving. Then I went and read everything I could find. That was the beginning of a long road, and it starts, as most strange roads do, with one very unusual man. His name, for the purposes of this story, was Dr. Marcus Vell. He was a neurologist working in a mid-sized city, well-respected, methodical, the kind of man who kept precise notes and trusted evidence above all else. He was not a spiritual person. He was not interested in mysticism or esoteric ideas. He had built his entire professional identity around the principle that the brain is a machine and unusual behavior has a mechanical explanation. Then a colleague referred a patient to him, and everything he believed began, slowly and irreversibly, to unravel. The patient was a librarian in his mid-40s, quiet, ordinary, the kind of person you forget moments after meeting them. He had been brought in because of something his co-workers had witnessed and could not explain. During a rest period, the man had fallen into an unusually deep sleep at his desk and had begun to speak. Not mumbling, not dreaming out loud in broken fragments, speaking clearly, in full, structured sentences about things that had nothing to do with libraries or daily life. His colleagues described it as listening to a lecture being delivered by someone who was not quite present in the room. When Vell first met the man, he was entirely unremarkable in every clinical sense. Good memory, normal cognition, no signs of any neurological disorder. He had no background in physics, philosophy, or theology. His reading habits ran toward regional history and gardening manuals. He remembered nothing unusual about himself. He was, by every available measure, a perfectly ordinary man. And yet, when he slept, something extraordinary used his voice. Vell began recording the sessions. He would sit in a dim room that smelled of old upholstery and radiator heat, the recorder running on the small table between them, and he would wait. The man would fall asleep within minutes, always the same way, like something pulling him under very gently. And then the voice would begin. It was the same voice, the same tone, but the vocabulary shifted entirely. The sentences became longer, more precise, more densely structured. Topics moved from the organization of inhabited planets to the mechanics of soul development to the nature of consciousness after death. All of it delivered with the calm certainty of someone reading from a document they had memorized long ago. Vell did not sleep well during those months.
He told almost no one what he was hearing. He kept going back because he could not stop, because every session added another layer to something that was beginning to feel less like a medical case and more like a transmission. And the question that sat at the back of his mind every single night, the one he could not shake no matter how many clinical frameworks he tried to apply, was this. If the knowledge was not coming from the man, then where exactly was it coming from? And more unsettling still, why now? Why this man? Why this moment? He did not have answers yet, but he was about to find someone who would help him start looking. Friends, if this is already pulling you in, please subscribe and leave a like.
It genuinely helps this reach the people who need to hear it, and we are only just getting started. The first thing Vel did, and this tells you everything about the kind of man he was not go to the press or write a paper. He made a list. He wrote down the names of 6 people he trusted completely, people from different disciplines, people who would not panic and would not dismiss what he was about to show them. A theologian who had spent years studying comparative mysticism, a theoretical physicist who openly admitted science had edges it could not see past, a philosopher who specialized in consciousness, 2 physicians who had worked with Vel long enough to know he was not given to fantasy, and 1 person who is described in his notes only as the archivist, whose identity was never confirmed. He called each of them personally. He did not explain over the telephone. He simply said, "I have something I need you to hear, and I need you to hear it before you decide what to think about it." They gathered in Vel's study on a winter evening. The room was small and warm, bookshelves on every wall, the sound of rain against the single window, a lamp throwing a narrow circle of yellow light across the desk where the recorder sat. Vel played them 40 minutes of the recordings. No one spoke. When it ended, the theologian asked Vel to play a specific section again. The physicist sat very still with his eyes on the ceiling. The philosopher had filled half a notebook with handwriting so fast it was almost illegible. What followed was not a debate about whether the phenomenon was real. They had all heard it. The question that immediately consumed the group was one of structure. Because what the recordings contained was not random. It was not the fragmented imagery of a dreaming mind or the circular loops of a dissociative episode. It was organized. It cross-referenced itself. Ideas introduced in one session would be elaborated in the next with a precision that implied an awareness of everything already said. It behaved less like a symptom and more like a curriculum. And that distinction, quiet as it sounds, changed the entire nature of what they were dealing with. They began attending the sessions together. They developed a method. Before each session, they would prepare written questions, covering different fields, different angles, testing for consistency and contradiction. They found neither contradiction nor evasion. Every question received an answer that fit inside the larger framework being built, session by session, like walls rising from a foundation that had been laid somewhere they could not see. The group started meeting separately afterward to compare notes, and the conversations would run until the early hours of the morning, the coffee going cold, the rain or wind or silence outside doing nothing to make any of it feel less surreal. There was one evening that Vel describes in detail in his private journal. They had asked the sleeping man a question about the nature of death, specifically about what happens to individual consciousness in the moment of physical ending. The answer lasted close to 30 minutes. It described a process so specific, so logically constructed, so devoid of the comfort or vagueness typical of spiritual teaching, that when it ended, no one in the room said anything for a long time. Then one of the physicians stood up, walked to the window, and stood there with his back to the room. Vel wrote, he was not crying. He was doing something quieter than that. He was adjusting. That word stayed with me when I first read it. Adjusting. Not converting. Not believing. Adjusting. The way you adjust when the ground shifts slightly beneath you and you realize the shift is permanent. The group did not talk about faith. They did not use spiritual language among themselves. They talked about data, about patterns, about the internal logic of what they were receiving. But every single one of them, in their private notes, used versions of the same phrase at some point during those months. It feels like something that already knew we were going to ask. And here is what made everything stranger still. The sessions were not passive. Whatever was speaking through the sleeping man seemed to be aware of the group, aware of their individual backgrounds, aware of their specific hesitations. It did not lecture at them. It engaged. It anticipated. Once, the physicist arrived having privately resolved to ask a question he had told no one about, a very specific technical question about energy states at a cosmological scale. He had not written it down. He had not mentioned it. The session that evening opened with a passage that addressed his question directly, before he had spoken a single word. He looked at Vel across the room. Vel looked back. Neither of them said anything. They did not need to. What they were sitting with now was no longer a medical curiosity or an intellectual puzzle. It was something that asked a much larger question, and it asked it every time they walked into that room. If something beyond human understanding had chosen this moment and this group of people to transmit something, what exactly was it trying to transmit? And what were they supposed to do with it? The physicist almost left the group after the third session. Not because he was frightened, because he was not frightened enough, and that terrified him more than anything else could have. He told Vel privately that what disturbed him most was how natural it all felt, how quickly his mind had stopped resisting and started simply absorbing, the way dry ground absorbs rain without questioning where it came from. He said, "I am a man who has spent his entire career demanding proof before accepting anything. And I am sitting in that room accepting things I cannot prove, and it feels completely correct, and I do not know what to do with that." Vel wrote it down. He wrote everything down, because he felt the same way and had no better answer. The group had been meeting for several months by this point, and a quiet shift had happened that none of them had formally acknowledged. They had stopped approaching the sessions as investigators and started approaching them as students. The questions they prepared became less clinical and more genuinely curious. Less, "Let us test the boundaries of this phenomenon." More, "We do not fully understand this yet, and we want to." That shift sounds small. It was not small. It meant that somewhere along the way, without a vote or a conversation, every person in that room had privately concluded that what they were receiving was real, was coherent, and was larger than any framework any of them had brought to the table. The material itself had begun to take on a shape that was unmistakable. It was not a collection of ideas. It was a structure. Each session built on the previous ones the way chapters build a book, each one assuming knowledge of what had come before, each one opening into the next with a precision that felt deliberate. The theologian was the first to say it out loud. He said, "This is not being improvised. This has already been written. We are not receiving creation. We are receiving delivery." The room went quiet when he said that, because everyone had been thinking it, and no one had wanted to be the first to give it a name. Vel began spending his evenings organizing the transcripts, laying them out across his dining table in the order they had been received, reading them end to end, looking for gaps or inconsistencies. He found none. What he found instead was something that made the hair on his arms rise every single time he came across it. Passages that seemed ordinary on their own, that became something entirely different when read alongside sessions from weeks earlier. As if the transmission had planted something in session 4 that only made full sense in session 19. As if it had been constructed with the reader already in mind, and the reader was expected to go back and reread once they had the context. Vel circled these passages in red pen. By the end, there were red circles on almost every page. It was the philosopher in the group who first raised the question that would change everything. She had been quiet for several sessions, listening more than speaking, filling her notebooks with dense, careful writing. Then one evening she arrived with a single typed page, placed it on the desk, and asked everyone to read it before the session began. It was a list of 17 internal cross-references she had found between different sessions, connections so precise and so structurally complex that the probability of them occurring randomly was, in her estimation, effectively zero. She did not frame this as a spiritual argument. She framed it as a mathematical one. And she ended the page with one sentence that no one in the room forgot. She wrote, "Something with a very long memory put this together." The sessions continued. The material continued to accumulate. And then, without warning, they stopped. The librarian came in one afternoon, sat down, fell asleep in the usual way, and nothing came. Silence. Just the sound of his breathing and the faint tick of the clock on the shelf. They waited an hour, then 2. Then Vel quietly turned off the recorder. They sat for a while longer without speaking. Then the theologian said, "I think it is finished." And the strange thing was, when Vel went home that evening and read through the complete transcripts from beginning to end, he realized the theologian was right. It was not interrupted. It was complete. Every thread had been closed. Every question that had been opened had been answered. It ended the way a book ends, not abruptly, but with a sense of arrival. What they had in their possession now was something no one had a clean name for. It was not a religious text. It was not a scientific document. It was not philosophy in any traditional sense. It was a map of something so large that none of them felt qualified to decide what to do with it. That conversation about what to do next was long and uncomfortable and honest in the way that conversations are when the stakes feel genuinely enormous. And it ended, eventually, with a decision that one member of the group would later describe as the most important and the most dangerous thing any of them ever did. They decided to compile it, to take every session, every transcript, every cross-referenced passage, and assemble it into a single coherent document. Not to publish it, not yet, just to have it exist in one place, in its complete form, so that its full weight could be understood. What none of them anticipated was what they would find inside the margins when they finally began that process. Because someone had already been there before them, and they had left something behind. The archivist, the one member of the group whose identity was never confirmed, had been quietly annotating the transcripts from the very beginning, not interpreting them, not summarizing them, leaving specific marks at specific passages. Marks that, when mapped across the full document, formed a pattern that the philosopher identified in less than an hour. The marks were not random. They were directional. They were pointing at something. And what they were pointing at suggested that the transmission had not arrived by accident, had not chosen this group by chance, and had not ended when it did without a reason. It had been building toward a specific revelation, one that none of them had seen coming. The manuscript described a universe so vast and so precisely organized that when the group first read the compiled version in full, one of the physicians walked outside into the cold night air and stood there for a long time, just looking up. He came back inside without saying anything. He sat down. He picked up the pages again, because the alternative, putting them down and pretending he had not read them, was no longer available to him. That is the thing about certain kinds of knowledge. Once it lands, it does not leave. It just settles deeper. What the manuscript described was not the universe of textbooks or telescopes. It was not cold, it was not empty, and it was absolutely not random. The transmission had spent several sessions building a picture so layered and so internally consistent that by the time you reached the outer edge of it, you realized you had been holding your breath. At the center of everything, according to the manuscript, exists a realm that has no beginning and no end. Not metaphorically, structurally. A place of such perfect stability that it functions as the fixed point around which all other existence rotates. The manuscript called it the still core. And around that core, like rings spreading from a stone dropped in water, everything else arranges itself in a pattern of extraordinary precision. 7 vast regions of organized space surround that center. Each one is governed by intelligences of a kind that make the word powerful feel entirely inadequate. Each one contains more inhabited worlds than any human number system can comfortably hold. Our galaxy sits inside one of these regions. Our solar system sits inside our galaxy. And our world sits inside our solar system like a single grain of sand on a beach that stretches further than sight can reach. The manuscript was not trying to make us feel small. It was trying to make us feel located. There is a difference. Feeling small is diminishing. Feeling located means you are part of something, a specific point in a specific structure, with a specific role that only you occupy. What struck the group most was not the scale. It was the organization. The manuscript described the governance of these regions with the kind of detail you would expect from someone describing a functioning institution. Not a mythology, not a symbolic hierarchy, a working system with defined roles, defined responsibilities, and a defined direction of movement. Everything moving, everything evolving, everything pointing across timescales that dwarf human history toward the still core at the center. The physicist in the group sat with this for several days before he said anything. Then he said, "The universe I have spent my career studying is the same universe this describes. The math is not wrong. The structure is not wrong. It is just more inhabited than I was told." The manuscript gave our world a designation in this system, not Earth, a name that the group spent considerable time attempting to translate accurately. And the closest they could get was something that meant the world of the long sleep. Not a judgment, a description. A marker of developmental stage, the way you might mark a seedling in a garden. Not to condemn it for being small, but to note where it is in its growth. And that name, sitting there on the page in plain language, was the first thing that made the full weight of the transmission land for me personally. Because it did not feel like poetry. It felt like a diagnosis. Our world, according to the manuscript, is young, not in geological terms, in conscious terms. It is a world still in early stages of understanding what it is part of, and where it is going. And that would be completely normal, completely expected for a world at this stage of development, except for one thing. Something happened here that was not supposed to happen. Something that changed the trajectory of this world in a way that left a mark still visible today. And the manuscript described it with a calm and a precision that made it somehow more disturbing than any dramatic language could have. Long before any history we have access to, this world was part of a network. Not a network in the technological sense, but a living connective system through which developing worlds received guidance, communication, and support from the larger structure surrounding them. Think of it as something like a current running through everything, quiet and constant, carrying information the way a river carries nutrients to everything growing along its banks. Our world was connected to that current, and then, because of a single decision made by a single being in a position of enormous responsibility, the connection was cut. The manuscript does not use the word betrayal, but that is what it describes. The being assigned to oversee the development of our world and several neighboring ones made a choice that the transmission characterizes not as evil, but as a catastrophic error in judgment. A decision to reject the framework of the larger system, to declare independence from it, to insist that a better path was possible without the guidance of the still core. And the consequence of that decision was not punishment in any conventional sense. It was simply the natural result of disconnection. Our world lost the current, the signal went quiet, and humanity began its long evolution in something close to silence, feeling its way through the dark, building religions and philosophies and sciences to answer questions it could no longer hear the answers to directly. The group sat with this for a long time, because it explained something that none of their existing frameworks had ever satisfactorily explained. Why, on a planet of such beauty and such intelligence, does suffering persist at a scale that seems almost designed? Why do civilizations rise and collapse? Why does wisdom seem to accumulate so slowly when the capacity for it seems so clearly present? The manuscript did not offer this as an excuse or as a comfort. It offered it as context, and context, it turns out, changes everything about how you read a situation. The philosopher in the group said something that evening that I keep coming back to. She said, "We have been diagnosing symptoms for thousands of years without knowing there was a cause." Every philosophy, every religion, every system of thought humanity has ever produced has been an attempt to answer a question whose origin we could not identify. And now, here it is. Not as mythology, not as metaphor, as a recorded event with a structure and a timeline and a consequence that is still unfolding. The room was very quiet after she said that, the kind of quiet that has weight to it. But here is what the manuscript made clear, and this is the part that matters most. The disconnection was not permanent. It was never designed to be permanent. It was a disruption in a process that had been running long before it occurred and would continue long after it was resolved. The current had not disappeared, it had simply become harder to reach. And across all the centuries of silence, something had been working, quietly and persistently, to restore the connection. Not from the outside, from within, through the one channel that the disruption could not close. And that channel, the manuscript said, runs directly through every human being alive. The manuscript named beings that have been watching this world for longer than human civilization has existed, and it named them not as gods, not as myths, but as workers. That word stopped me completely when I first read it. Not rulers, not saviors, workers. Beings with specific functions, specific assignments, specific areas of responsibility, showing up every day to do a job in a system so large that our entire planet represents something closer to a single file in an archive the size of a continent. And the reason that word hit so hard was not because it diminished them. It was because it made them real in a way that no mythological language ever could. The philosopher had been working through a particular section of the compiled manuscript for several days when she brought it to the group. She laid the pages out across the table and walked everyone through what she had found, slowly and carefully, the way you present something you know is going to take time to absorb. The manuscript described several distinct categories of beings operating within and around our world, each with a different function, each operating at a different level of the system. They were not interchangeable. They were not all-powerful. They had roles the way a surgeon and an architect and a translator all have roles, different skills, different domains, different relationships to the people they serve. Some of these beings operated at the level of entire civilizations, coordinating the broad sweep of human development across centuries, nudging conditions in directions that created more opportunity for conscious growth. The manuscript described them as working with probability rather than control, the way a gardener works with soil conditions and light rather than forcing a plant to grow. They did not override human choice. They could not. The system, according to the manuscript, was built specifically around the preservation of individual choice as the primary mechanism of development. Remove the freedom to choose wrongly, and you remove the entire engine of growth. They understood that. They worked with it rather than against it. Others operated much closer to the individual level, and this is the part that made the theologian go very quiet for the rest of that session. The manuscript described beings whose entire function was to accompany individual human beings through their lives. Not to protect them from difficulty, not to intervene in their decisions, but to be present, to hold something steady in the field around a person that made it slightly easier for that person to access their own deeper awareness. The manuscript described this function with the same matter-of-fact precision it used to describe everything else, and that precision was what made it land. It was not poetic, it was procedural. These beings had a job. The job was presence, and they did it without recognition, without request, and without end. Vell had written in his journal about this section specifically. He wrote, "I have spent my career studying the brain, and I have never been able to fully explain the phenomenon of sudden clarity. The moment when a patient who has been confused for weeks suddenly sees their situation with complete lucidity. The moment when a solution arrives not through effort, but through stillness. I have called it many things. I have never had a framework for it that felt complete. I think I do now." Reading that entry, I understood exactly what he meant. Because most of us have had that moment. The inexplicable clarity that arrives uninvited. The sense of being steadied by something you cannot see. The manuscript was not introducing a new idea. It was giving a name to something already known. The group spent a long time with this section, not debating it, sitting with it, because what it implied about the texture of ordinary human life was significant in a way that took time to fully feel. Every moment of unexpected insight, every instinct that turned out to be correct, every time a person chose the harder right thing over the easier wrong one, all of it happened inside a field that was being quietly tended. Not controlled, tended. The way you tend a fire, not by burning things for it, but by making sure the conditions stay right for it to keep burning on its own. What the manuscript made clear was that the isolation caused by the disconnection had never meant abandonment. The larger system had not turned its back on this world. It had simply lost one channel of communication and continued working through every other channel available. And there were more of those than anyone had suspected. And then the manuscript said something about death that made the entire room change temperature. And I mean that almost literally, because the physician sitting closest to the window stood up and closed it even though it was already closed, and nobody said anything about that, because everyone in the room was doing their own version of the same thing, which was finding something to do with their hands while they processed what they had just heard. The manuscript stated, plainly and without softening, that death as humanity understands it does not exist. Not in the way we fear it, not as an ending. What we call death is a transition point in a much longer process, the moment when one stage of development closes and the next one opens. Consciousness does not stop, it relocates. And the relocation is not random. It follows a structure as precise and as purposeful as everything else the manuscript had described. The individual awareness that developed inside a human life, every experience, every choice, every moment of growth or failure or love or loss, none of it dissolves. It moves forward, carrying everything it has gathered into the next stage of a journey that the manuscript described as genuinely without end. The specific mechanism the manuscript described was unlike anything in any religious or philosophical tradition any of them had encountered. It was not reincarnation in the traditional sense, returning to the same world to repeat the same lessons. It was not heaven in the traditional sense, a static reward at the end of effort. It was progression, a series of increasingly expansive states of existence, each one building on the last, each one offering a deeper engagement with the still core that sits at the center of everything. The manuscript described worlds specifically designed for this purpose, places where the development that could not be completed in a single human life continues under conditions calibrated exactly for what comes next. Vell wrote one line about this section that I have thought about more than almost anything else in this entire story. He wrote, "If this is true, then nothing I have ever lost is actually gone." And I have been carrying that sentence around for a long time now, turning it over, testing its weight. Because it is either the most important thing anyone has ever written, or it is a beautiful fiction. And the terrifying, exhilarating thing is that the rest of the manuscript, everything still to come, makes it genuinely difficult to dismiss. The manuscript dedicated more pages to a single historical figure than to any other subject in the entire document, and what it said about that figure would have been enough, on its own, to make the whole thing controversial beyond any reasonable management. But it was not controversial in the way you might expect. It was not scandalous. It was not reductive. It was the opposite of reductive. It took someone whose story most people think they already know and expanded that story so far beyond its familiar edges that by the time you finished reading, the version you had grown up with felt like a thumbnail sketch of a painting the size of a building. The group had been working through the compiled manuscript in sequence, section by section, and when they reached this part, the sessions with the sleeping librarian were already months behind them. They were working from transcripts now, assembled and organized, sitting in Vell's study with the pages spread across every available surface. The theologian had been quiet for most of the previous sessions, more quiet than usual, and Vell had noticed. He asked him about it privately, and the theologian said, "I am preparing myself, because I have spent my entire career studying this particular figure, and I suspect what comes next is going to require me to hold everything I know very loosely." He was right. The manuscript described a being of vast cosmic intelligence who chose, deliberately and with full awareness of what it would involve, to compress the entirety of that intelligence into a single human life. Not to observe humanity from a comfortable distance, not to deliver a message through a prophet and then withdraw, to actually become one of us, to grow up in a specific family, in a specific place, speaking a specific language, feeling hunger and cold and confusion and grief from the inside. The manuscript was clear that this was not a performance. It was not a visitation. It was a complete and genuine immersion. A being that had helped architect entire regions of the cosmos chose to experience what it felt like to be a child who skinned his knee and cried for his mother. The theologian read that passage 3 times before he looked up. Then he said, very quietly, "That is the most profound thing I have ever read about this person, and the most uncomfortable, because if it is true, then the entire debate about his nature, human or divine, has been asking the wrong question entirely. The question was never which one. The question was why someone would choose to be both, fully and simultaneously, and what that choice was meant to demonstrate." The manuscript was unambiguous on this point. His purpose was not primarily to deliver teachings, though he did. It was not primarily to demonstrate miracles, though the manuscript addressed those separately. His primary purpose was to live a human life so completely and so honestly that it would serve as a permanent reference point for every human being who came after him. A demonstration, not a doctrine. A life lived as an answer to the question of how it is possible to carry a fragment of the divine inside you while also being fully, messily, vulnerably human. He was not showing humanity what God looks like from above. He was showing humanity what the divine looks like when it chooses to walk at ground level, in the dust, in the ordinary, in the difficult. The physicist in the group said something during that session that I have never forgotten. He said, "In my field, when we want to understand a system, we sometimes introduce a probe, something that enters the system, experiences it from the inside, and returns data that could never be gathered from the outside. That is what this describes. Not a rescue, not a punishment for failure. A probe, sent by something that genuinely wanted to understand us, not just observe us." The room was silent for a moment. Then the theologian said, "And the probe stayed." He did not retrieve the data and withdraw. He stayed until the end. And the physicist nodded and said nothing more, because there was nothing more to say. What made this section of the manuscript structurally remarkable was its insistence on the years that no historical record had captured. The period between the figure's early youth and the beginning of his known public life represented, in conventional accounts, a blank. The manuscript did not treat it as a blank. It described a period of deliberate and wide-ranging preparation, a journey through cultures and traditions and schools of thought that spanned a considerable portion of the known world at the time. He did not travel to collect religion. He traveled to complete an education that had begun before his birth and needed to be finished from the inside of a human body. The manuscript described specific encounters during this period with a precision that made the group deeply uncomfortable in the best possible way. Not because the details were sensational, but because they were mundane. He argued with a teacher in one city about the nature of consciousness and left the argument unresolved because he was more interested in the teacher's honesty than in winning. He spent time in a community of scholars who had devoted their lives to understanding the nature of time, and he listened more than he spoke, and when he did speak, the scholars remembered what he said for years afterward without being able to fully explain why. He sat with people who were suffering and did not immediately offer comfort. He sat with the discomfort first. He let it be real before he offered anything in response to it. These descriptions landed differently than the theological accounts any of them had grown up with. They landed as portraits of a person, not a symbol, not a doctrine. A person who was working something out in real time, through real experience, because the working out was the point. Because a being of his nature and origin could not complete its mission by thinking about human life from a distance. It had to be lived. Every awkward conversation, every moment of physical exhaustion, every instance of being misunderstood by someone he cared about, all of it was necessary. All of it was the curriculum. And what emerged from that curriculum, after years of it, was not a polished religious figure with carefully prepared speeches. It was someone who understood suffering from the inside and chose, despite that understanding, to keep moving toward people rather than away from them. The archivist's margin notes, those quiet directional marks the group had discovered in the compiled manuscript, were particularly dense in this section, more concentrated here than anywhere else in the document. And when the philosopher mapped them against the surrounding text, she found that they were not pointing at the grand cosmic claims. They were pointing at the small human moments, the arguments, the silences, the unremarkable days. As if whatever had left those marks wanted to make absolutely certain that whoever read this document understood. The most important thing in this entire section is not the cosmic identity of the figure being described. It is what he chose to do with it, one ordinary day at a time. And that realization pointed directly toward the next section of the manuscript, which turned out to be the most difficult thing the group had ever been asked to hold. The manuscript said his death was a mistake, not a plan, not a necessary sacrifice written into the structure of the cosmos before the world began. A mistake, made by frightened people who did not understand what they were looking at and chose, in that fear, the most permanent available response. The group sat with that for a long time, because if you have grown up inside any tradition that places his death at the center of everything, as the hinge on which all of human history turns, as the price that had to be paid, reading those words does something to you that is very hard to describe. It is not comfortable. It is not a relief. It is more like being told that the story you have been carrying since childhood has a different ending, and the ending you were given, the one built around debt and payment and blood as currency, was not the story at all. The theologian was the one who worked through this most visibly. He had spent his entire career inside a framework where the suffering of this figure was sacred, was necessary, was the point. And now he was sitting with a document that said, no. The point was the life. The point was the demonstration. The point was every ordinary morning he woke up and chose to be present with the people around him rather than withdrawing into the cosmic awareness he carried. His departure from this world was not the climax of his mission. It was the interruption of it. And the people who caused that interruption were not villains in a divine drama. They were human beings who encountered something they could not process and responded the way frightened people respond, by trying to remove the source of their discomfort. The manuscript was careful here. It did not assign blame in any simple direction. It described a convergence of factors: institutional fear, political pressure, the specific social dynamics of the time and place, all of it creating a situation in which the removal of this figure seemed, to the people involved, like the most manageable option. The manuscript described this the way a historian describes a preventable disaster: factual, precise, and suffused with a sadness that had no anger in it, just the quiet weight of something that did not need to happen. What came after, according to the manuscript, compounded the original loss, because the people who carried his memory forward, who built institutions around his name, who devoted their lives to preserving what he had done, made a decision, perhaps unconsciously, to center everything on the ending rather than on the life. And in centering the ending, they took a message about inner transformation and rebuilt it as a system of external debt. You owe something because of what happened. You must earn your way back into goodness. You are fundamentally insufficient, and the proof of that insufficiency is the suffering that was required to address it. The manuscript described this shift not as a conspiracy, but as a very human response to grief. When we lose something important, we make meaning from the loss, and sometimes the meaning we make obscures the thing we lost. The theologian sat very still through the reading of this section. When it was finished, he did not speak for several minutes. Then he said, "I have spent my life teaching people that they are broken and that the brokenness is the starting point of everything. And this document is telling me that was never his message. His message was that you are already carrying something whole inside you, and the work is not to repair a deficiency, but to learn to trust what is already there." The room was quiet. Then he said, more softly, "I think I have been doing this wrong for a very long time. Nobody in the room said anything to correct him, because the manuscript had said it plainly, and there was nothing to add. The inner fragment that the manuscript had described earlier, the permanent piece of original intelligence that accompanies every human being through their life, was central to this section. Because what the manuscript was arguing was that the figure at the center of this story had come, in significant part, to demonstrate what it looks like when a human being lives in full conscious alignment with that inner fragment. Not performing it, not preaching about it, living it. Every choice he made, every person he turned toward, every moment he chose honesty over comfort, was a visible expression of what that alignment produces. He was not showing people what God demands of them. He was showing them what they are already capable of when they stop working against the deepest thing inside themselves. That is a completely different story than the one most of the world inherited. And the group understood, sitting in that room, why it had not survived in its original form. Because a story that tells people they are already equipped, already accompanied, already carrying the seed of everything they are searching for outside themselves, that story does not build institutions. It does not create dependency. It does not require intermediaries. And the people who came after him needed to build something that would last, something with structure and authority and continuity. So they built it from the material that was most emotionally powerful: the ending, the loss, the debt. And in doing so, they buried the part of his message that was most alive. The group did not discuss whether the manuscript was asking them to abandon their existing beliefs. That conversation never happened because the manuscript itself never invited it. What it invited, in this section and throughout, was something different and in some ways harder. It invited the reader to hold what they already knew and simply make more room. To let the container get bigger without throwing out what was already inside it. The theologian described it later as the difference between renovating a house and burning it down. Same address, same foundations, but with windows now where there used to be walls. What none of them were prepared for was what came immediately after this section, because the manuscript did not linger on the implications of what it had just described. It moved forward, as if it had said what needed to be said and trusted the reader to carry it. And what it moved into was a passage that the group would later describe, collectively and without exaggeration, as the most unusual thing in the entire document. Not because of what it said about the cosmos or about history or about the nature of consciousness, but because of what it said about the people reading it. Specifically, directly, as if it had known, long before any of them were born, that they would be sitting in that room on that particular evening, and it had something it needed to say to them personally. The passage that stopped everyone cold was not about the cosmos. It was about us, right now. This specific moment in history. And the manuscript described it with the kind of precision that makes you set the page down and look around the room as if checking whether the walls are still where you left them. It described a stage in the development of a world that it called the threshold period. Not a golden age, not a collapse, a threshold. The moment when a civilization has accumulated enough knowledge to move in either direction, forward into something genuinely new, or backward into a darkness of its own making. And the description it gave of what a threshold period looks and feels like from the inside was so specific, so detailed, so exactly correspondent to the world outside Vell's study window, that the physician who had been the most skeptical member of the group from the very beginning put his copy of the transcript face down on the table and said, "It is describing right now." Not as prophecy, as a diagnostic profile. The manuscript described a threshold civilization as one in which the tools of enormous creative power and the tools of enormous destructive power arrive at the same historical moment, carried by the same hands, operated by minds that have not yet developed the interior depth to use either one wisely. It described a civilization where communication becomes nearly infinite, but genuine understanding becomes increasingly rare. Where information accelerates, but wisdom moves at the same slow pace it always has, because wisdom does not accelerate, it deepens, and deepening requires something that acceleration actively works against, which is stillness. The physicist nodded slowly as the philosopher read this section aloud. He nodded the way people nod when they hear something they already knew, but had never heard articulated. What made this section different from everything that had come before was its tone. Throughout the manuscript, the voice of the transmission had been measured, detailed, almost clinical in its precision. Here it shifted slightly. Not to urgency exactly, but to something closer to directness. As if the distance that had been maintained up until this point was no longer serving the communication. The manuscript said plainly that threshold periods do not resolve themselves. They are resolved by individuals. Not by leaders or institutions or collective movements, though those can help. By individuals who make a specific internal decision before any external action. The decision to take seriously what they already sense is true. The quiet, persistent sense that there is more to existence than the surface of it. And to let that decision change the texture of how they move through their days. The group sat with this for a long time. Because what the manuscript was describing was not a dramatic awakening. It was not a revelation that arrives in a flash and reorganizes everything at once. It was something quieter and, in many ways, more demanding. A sustained, private, daily choice to stay awake, to keep asking, to resist the pull toward the comfortable explanation and stay a little longer in the honest question. The manuscript used a phrase here that Vell underlined twice and circled and then drew a line from to the margin where he wrote a single word. Yes. The phrase was this: the weight of a civilization shifts not when enough people shout the same thing, but when enough people quietly decide to live as if the deeper thing is real. The philosopher read that sentence out loud twice. Nobody asked her to. She just read it again, because once was not enough, and I understand that completely. Because that sentence contains something that most motivational language misses entirely. It does not ask you to believe. It does not ask you to convert or commit or declare anything publicly. It asks you to live as if. To proceed on the assumption that the thing you sense in your quietest moments is not a trick of the mind, but a signal from something real. And to let that assumption accumulate in your choices, your attention, your relationships, your small daily decisions, until the cumulative weight of it becomes undeniable. Not to you first, to the world around you. Because that is how thresholds get crossed. Not by announcement, by accumulation. The manuscript closed its description of the threshold period with something the group would debate for months afterward. It said that our world was not uniquely fragile at this moment. It said that every world in the long sleep had passed through a version of this same stage. And every single one of them had crossed the threshold eventually. Not all in the same way, not all without cost, but every one. The still core at the center of everything did not abandon its developing worlds at the edge of the threshold. It was present there the way it had always been present, through the inner channel that ran through every living person, quiet and constant, and completely available to anyone who chose to stop and listen. The question was never whether the world would make it. The question was how long the crossing would take, and how much would be lost or preserved in the process. And that, the manuscript stated in its final passage on this subject, depended entirely on individual human beings making individual human choices, starting now, starting today, starting with whoever happened to be reading these words. Vell was found in his study on a morning in late autumn, sitting in his chair with a cup of tea gone cold on the desk beside him, the compiled manuscript open in his lap, his reading glasses still on. He had passed quietly in the night. The colleague who found him said that his expression was not distressed. It was the expression of someone who had just finished something important and was satisfied with how it had gone. On the desk beside the cold tea was a single handwritten page, separate from everything else, clearly written that same evening. It was not addressed to anyone specifically. It began mid-thought, the way a person writes when they are continuing a conversation with themselves that has been going on for years. He wrote, "I came into this as a man who believed that the brain was the ceiling of human experience. I leave it as a man who believes the brain is a door. I do not know with certainty what is on the other side of that door. But I have spent years now in the company of a document that describes it in more detail and with more internal consistency than anything else I have ever encountered. And the thing that moves me most, sitting here tonight, is not the cosmology. It is not the hierarchy of beings or the structure of the universe or even the description of what happens after we leave this world. What moves me most is the simplicity of what it asks from us. Not belief, not devotion, not membership in anything. Just attention. Just the willingness to take seriously the quietest, deepest thing inside yourself. Just the decision to stop pretending that the surface of life is all there is, and to start living as if the depth of it is real. He wrote one more paragraph after that. He wrote, "The manuscript has no author. No institution stands behind it. No one gains power or money or influence from its existence. It simply is what it is, a document that arrived through a channel no one can fully explain, describing a universe of staggering beauty and purpose, insisting that every human being alive is an irreplaceable part of that purpose, and asking nothing in return except that you wake up. I think that is the most trustworthy thing about it. It does not need you to believe it. It is simply here. And it will still be here long after every argument about its origins has exhausted itself." The page ended there. Vell never finished the sentence he had started at the bottom of the page. But the colleague who found him said the unfinished sentence began with the words, "And maybe that is enough." The manuscript still exists. It is held by the archivist, whose identity remains unknown. Copies have circulated quietly for years among people who found them the same way Vell found the original. Not by searching, but by being handed a single page with no context and told, "Read this and tell me a human being wrote it." Every one of those people describes the same experience, the same door opening, the same quiet interior shift that does not announce itself loudly, but does not leave. The same sense of having been located in something much larger than they had previously understood themselves to be part of. The moral of this entire story is not that a mysterious document contains the answers to everything. The moral is that the most important things were never hidden behind a locked door requiring a special key. They were always accessible through the one channel that cannot be closed, the one that runs directly through you. Every human being walking this earth right now carries something ancient and intact at their center. The manuscript did not put it there. It simply described it. And the description, for those who encounter it, has a way of making the thing it describes impossible to ignore. Now, I want to ask you something directly, and I want you to think about it honestly before you answer. If everything you have heard today is true, if the universe is genuinely organized, genuinely inhabited, genuinely moving towards something, and if you are genuinely a necessary part of that movement, then what exactly have you been waiting for? What is the version of your life that becomes possible the moment you stop treating your deepest instincts as noise and start treating them as signal? Write it in the comments. I am genuinely asking, because I think the answer you give might surprise you. If this story moved something in you, please leave a like and subscribe to the channel. It helps more than you know, and it means the next story finds the people who need it.